So we'll start with the first speaker of this morning session. That's Professor Tom Stoneham. He is Professor of Philosophy and Ethics, and he is the lead of the UKRI Center for Doctoral Training in AI Systems at the University of York. He has been head of the department at York 3 times, and he also was the inaugural dean of the graduate school. He convenes an MA in Applied Ethics and Governance at of Data Privacy. Tom is a regular speaker both in the UK and abroad, and an expert advisor on issues such as social, political, and environmental issues arising from the rollout and the implementation of AI. He has published widely on many areas, from early model philosophy to dreaming and trauma. Currently, he is working on non-perfectioning ethical theory.
Thank you. I come in as not an AI expert, but as a philosopher. And I don't come here to tell you not to do things. I come here to help you do things ethically. Machine learning, deep learning, they're all predictive AI, but a lot of people talk about generative AI as if it was something different. I see that as everything as a form of predictive AI. And what I'm most interested in is when AI techniques are used to predict human behaviors. I'll mention briefly other uses, but let's just concentrate on this. And there's 3 kinds of prediction of human behavior we might be using machine learning for. We might be using it to predict population behaviors, and I noticed one of the posters out there is on a project around macroeconomics and household behaviors. We might be using it to predict individual behaviors. This is, we've heard a lot about use for recidivism predictions, for loans, for mortgages. And then we've got the class of predicting responses to instructions. And this is the very familiar class to the world of ChatGPTs and Geminis, where we prompt it with a question or an instruction for a task, and it predicts a human response to that and gives us that response. Of course, we can ask which human response, and if you use off-the-peg ChatGPT or Gemini, you have little control over that unless you're quite good at prompt engineering. If you use your own models, you can write those system directives which determine, or at least influence, which kind of human response you're going to get. But in all cases, what they're looking for is the highest probability given their training data and your input. And familiarly, these can be biased in various ways because of biases in the training data, but also perhaps because of introduced bias in the training process. Even the most basic levels of classification can introduce bias. As linguists have spotted, ChatGPT uses the word delve much more than Westerners do, but with a similar profile to Nigerian English speakers. We know why. But it can also reduce diversity, hence the image there of an average face taken from a paper looking at different facial characteristics. The output will always be the average or the typical, or as I say to my students when I'm encouraging them not to use it, the mediocre. Chatbots have very special issues as well, and these are really important to be aware of. They speak with epistemic authority. They speak like a professor, in whole paragraphs, well structured. They know where they're going when they start speaking. Those are all indicators of expertise, of knowledge. As a result, people tend to trust them. They're designed like that. We're often told it's trained on the whole of the internet. Well, most people on the internet don't speak like that. If ChatGPT was producing its responses using the language of a 13-year-old, you wouldn't trust it. There's also the problem of sycophancy, or perhaps better called flattery. Whenever you ask a question, you always get back, "What a great question," even if it wasn't. You're always told, if you criticize it, you're always told, "You're right." You get opinion sycophancy and factual sycophancy. You can manipulate these modules to start asserting falsehoods back to you. But opinion sycophancy is much more problematic. They reinforce your existing opinions. They pick up on them. Another feature that's not often talked about is imaginative escalation. They draw you in. At the end of some conversation, there's always the question, would you like more? They always overproduce information. They always try to keep the conversation going. These are all design features. These are all conscious design features. All those properties, humans do all those things. They can have value. I hope I have some epistemic authority. I trade on it sometimes. I sometimes use flattery to encourage students to keep going in what they're doing. And we all engage in imaginative escalation when we read a novel. The problem is when these things are used without caution, when they're used unselectively. And these are very specific things we have to be aware of. So I'm just going to briefly have an aside about predicting the non-human. A lot of you will be doing research in this area. And I want to just kind of say, well, this is different to what I'm most interested in. Most of your data management and research ethics processes will actually be really helpful in these cases. But if you're using AI, you're using machine learning in these cases, you need to be aware of a few other things. It's not an entirely ethically clean technology. So how did the labeling and classification happen? If you're using some classified data, where did that come from? We know a lot of this is done using very exploitative labor practices. We also know that training on large data sets is massively, massively energy intensive. Are you using too big a data set? The Royal Society of Engineering has recently published a report on frugal computing. Think about this. Don't just throw everything at it, because there's a consequence. And also think about inference as well. Some inference uses more compute than others. I give this famous example from Google. It doesn't do this anymore. It doesn't do this anymore because they solved the problem. The way they solved the problem, if you run a model offline and you try to monitor the compute, it's about 10 to 20 times the energy use to do a really simple piece of arithmetic as to answer a language-based question with an LLM. So, are you using the right model for the inferences? They may be able to get there, but think about it. It is terrifying, the energy use that we're looking at. I'm not going to go into this in detail. There's lots published on this. But one of the things I calculated last year, just for fun, is my personal carbon footprint. And that is equivalent to approximately 7 million AI-generated images. Now, that might sound like a really big number. But remember, people generating AI images usually generate 10, 20 at a time to get the one they want. If you're generating AI images to illustrate your PowerPoints, think about that. And of course, 2.5 billion tons of CO2 there, that's already the CO2 emission for the EU 27 without AI. So these are pretty big things. The energy use, there's a proposal for 2 data centres outside Scotland, 2 hyperscalers. They will use 18% of the Scottish national grid, 2 data centres. And the water use is also, again, there are technologies which use less water, but they're slower to develop, they're harder to use, they're less efficient in the sense of getting the compute done fast. So these are really important things. We have water shortages in winter in Kent, okay? And yet they're building data centers in the southeast. These are all consequences of the decisions you make when you're using these tools. Okay, so back to human prediction of AI. There are a class of impermissible uses. I'm going to give examples which I think fall into that class. I know that there's always discussion to be had, but we can agree that there are going to be a class of impermissible uses. Using population predictions to manipulate or coerce populations is clearly a class of impermissible uses. There's some borderline cases like the nudge unit, the famous nudge unit in the Cameron government was trying to manipulate population behaviour. You could do that more efficiently now, more intelligently, but there are ethical questions about that. It's paternalistic. Targeting individuals, predicting on the basis of individual prediction is deeply, deeply problematic. The computer says no syndrome is really problematic because those individuals, when a person is making a decision about whether you should get a mortgage, they're able to take into account aspects of the individual which makes you different from the population that you might fall under. You might live in a postcode with very bad debt repayment records because your family comes from there, but really you've got a perfect credit history. How do you cope with these things? So it's very risky, and we're seeing more and more of this in predictive policing. Is on the horizon. It's not using ML at the moment, it's using other things, but we're starting to have laws which allow predictive policing in this country. And Lavender, look it up. But there's another class which is quite important, which is the delegation of tasks to AI tools, where those tasks require individuals to exercise their own integrity. Simple examples of this are authorship. When you put your name as an author, you are taking a certain sort of responsibility for the output there. And in particular, you are claiming that you have exercised, you have made judgments according to a norm of truth. You think that this is true. If you're delegating some of that authorship to an AI tool, you're not exercising the norm of truth unless you go back and accept all those things for yourself and check that they're right. Peer reviews, recruitment, promotion, evaluation. Delegating tasks to AI here seem to violate the norm of respect for persons. Also, I've seen AI-generated peer reviews, and they're really boring. The one thing they don't have is expert input. A good peer review brings in something that wasn't in the application. Anyway, but those are sort of areas. Your university, all universities have rules around three. The European Commission has published some very good guidelines around this. You need to check that. Unfortunately, there's lots of variance across disciplines and across institutions at the moment, making it very complicated. But there is a project to try to create a standardized framework which will help people steer this through that. So that's the impermissible uses, but I'm really quite interested in, once we move outside that case, that large other area. You see, there's lots of permissible uses where we're encouraged to use AI for efficiency reasons. And these are permissible, and they clearly are in some senses more efficient. Okay? They can do things quicker than a person. I put a caveat there. They do things quicker than a person by throwing a huge amount of resource at it. If you put that much energy expended on human beings on the task, it wouldn't be quicker. It's just, they somehow managed, the cleverness is they break up tasks we can't break up into 1,000 or more steps and distribute those. So quick, but it's quick at a cost. But also, they transfer the cost from labour to capital. You don't have to employ as many people, as the Vice-Chancellor was mentioning. This is why so many businesses are moving to this, because if you own a business, employing people is a problem. It's your biggest cost, and it's your most unreliable cost. And also thereby increases productivity. So politicians like it because the output per person is greater. Okay? Why we thought that was a great measure of economic well-being, I don't know. But there are cases where it's ethically better to use real people. Now, I'm going to ask you about those in a minute. But just to give you some examples where there are things that are permissible, but you might think they're suboptimal. So probably most people in this room wouldn't give a child a toy gun. Maybe some would, and there's good reasons for that difference. It's permissible, but somehow we think it's suboptimal. Or more obviously, most of us go out for a meal, spend money on a meal. That amount of money we spend on a meal could feed a lot of people who aren't getting well fed. Doesn't mean you should never go out for a meal. Okay, it's permissible, that's fine. But you need to be conscious about these decisions. So let's move into that sort of problem space. This is an example. The QR code or the Menti link at the bottom will take you to this. I'm going to leave it running all day and look at the results later. This is an exercise I always do when I'm training in ethics. And I tend to do it as a group exercise and get them to present on it. But you say, it would be possible to use these ubiquitous smart microphones to pick up those telltale sonic patterns of domestic abuse and act on it. If you were asked to join such a project, would you do it? Okay, so that's on the Menti for you to give your opinion there. I tend to find, I've done this with a group of Chinese students and they were much more positive about it, which was a very interesting result. But then there are lots of other cases. Generating images, I talked about worries about that. Generating meeting notes, summarizing papers, okay? There's a whole list of them on the Menti to go through. While you're thinking about those, I just want to give you a few things to take into account. Just pick up a few little bits of research that are relevant here. So GPs are using and were found to be using this before it was licensed by the NHS. And even now, the NHS licensed some meeting note apps. It turns out that, as Wes Streeting discovered in his local pub, that a lot of GPs are just using ChatGPT anyway. Why is this a problem? Well, my colleague Mark Sujan pointed out really nicely last year. Because when it's taking meeting notes, it's writing the most probable text version of what it can hear. Okay, so if someone has a very unusual symptom, that's a very improbable thing. So it's like the system's likely not to record it. So there are huge risks around this. As I say, the NHS is working on this and has its own tools which are fine-tuned to try to reduce these risks. But it's a huge risk. There's automation bias. I've got two examples here which are very, very different. Police use of live facial recognition generates a huge problem with automation bias. Police overtrust it. The example there was a woman who was 8 months pregnant, arrested and held for 11 hours for carjacking, even though the CCTV video that was used for the facial recognition match was of someone who wasn't pregnant. Okay? They just overtrusted it. And also we're seeing it that's a paper in radiology showing that there's automation bias there. And it's much more common with younger, less experienced radiologists. The reason being, of course, the more experienced you are, the more of your job is about checking other people's work. If you haven't got to that point in your career, you're at risk from this. And the other thing is the damage to us. There's a growing body of evidence that there's damage to us. And this is a very favorite quote from Ivan Illich, the Mexican philosopher. Over-efficient tools can upset the relationship between what people need to do by themselves and what they can obtain ready-made. And we're in risk there. So I'm aware of time. I'm not going to look at those. I will share the results later. So I just want to go on to my last point. Okay, so it's complicated. There's lots of very difficult issues. How do you, as a researcher, find your way through this? We have a model from research ethics, but research ethics is a procedural liability insurance. You go through this process and then you can say, I've done it, I'm fine. So I hope you've realised a lot of the ethical issues around AI, liability insurance isn't enough. It's still complicated, even if you've got that. Regulation is happening in different ways, different speeds, both hard and soft. The problem with regulation is it removes ethical judgment from the individual. It says just follow these rules and you don't have to think. And that's the same problem with appealing to ethics experts or panels, however you want to do it, to make the decisions. It's outsourcing your responsibility. So really, the answer has to be, for you as researchers, is to learn, okay, where's the category of the impermissible? Where are the hard rules? But also, what do I do in this messy space? And you have to decide for yourself. But that's actually something, you may not realize it, but you've been trained to do throughout your life. If you are a friend, a lover, a parent, a child, you have complex personal relationships which bring up ethical issues. You will have learned to think through those, to find a way through those spaces where things are permissible, but they may be suboptimal, what your choices are. What I want to say to all of you is, remember, you have a skill set that you use outside your academic work, and you need to bring this to bear when you're making ethical decisions within your academic work. Thank you.